Hello, dear friends, and welcome to our weekly program coming from Northern California from the Divine Light Spiritist Group. And we're live broadcasting on the YouTube channel of Bisea Spiritual Healing Center, as well as Divine Light Spiritist Group. And we're also live broadcasting on the Divine Light Facebook page. Welcome, dear friends. Here we are gathering one more time, thanks to God, studying the Spirit's teachings of the Gospel according to Spiritism by Allan Kardec. What we're doing is focusing on the Spirit's teachings. Every chapter that Allan Kardec gifts us with has at the end a number of spirits who came through and helped us understand, interpret, guide us through the chapters, the main chapters. And we're finding us tonight at chapter 5 of the Gospel according to Spiritism, which is entitled, Blessed are the suffering, for they shall draw closer to God. Blessed are the afflicted, for they shall draw closer to God. And last week we studied items 19 through 21. And essentially what we learned was that there is such a thing as to suffer well. And how do we suffer well? The spirits taught us that suffering well entails resignation and courage. We need courage and we need to resign to our suffering. That's what they call suffering well. Furthermore, the spirits also reminded us that the remedy for evil is what? The remedy for evil is most and foremost faith, our faith in God. And lastly, they spoke about happiness on earth, that happiness on earth is just not quite possible in its entirety yet. But the good thing is, we won't get stuck on this level. We are learning, we're progressing. All of it is temporary. And of course, by getting the bigger picture, by studying and practicing the good, we will learn to become more happy, to become happier. So today, that was last week. So today we will be focusing on items 21 through 23. So 2 items. They will be very filled with amazing information for us to shift our perspective. The perspective that the spirits tonight will offer to us will help us to become happier, will help us to ease the pressure in our lives. Because we're all afflicted, we're all suffering to a certain degree. But we want to suffer well, and we don't want to suffer unnecessarily. So for this purpose, we will be looking at the first chapter, which is by the spirit Sanson, who was a former member of the Parisian Society, Spiritist Society. And this message came through in 1863. It's part of chapter 5, Blessed are the Afflicted. It's item 21 if you want to follow along. We're not going to read the whole expose by the spirit. We're going to pick out the highlights. It's entitled The Loss of Loved Ones and Premature Deaths. Something that we on earth are grappling with. None of us likes to lose a loved one, and even less so when it's a child, a young person. So for this purpose, we're going to shift to sharing the screen. So we have a little bit of a visual because it's always easier to understand and follow along and get the message. Hold on, it's not happening if we have a visual. Okay. All right, we did it. Here we go. All right. Just to make sure, we're going to quickly check the technology, see that we are in business. Thank you for bearing with us. Here we go. Very good. So, Spirit's teachings of the Gospel according to Spiritism, items 21 to 23, chapter 5. Let's see whether it transports forward. So, today will be loss of a loved ones and premature death. Let's see, is it transporting? Yes, it is. We are doing well, friends. We like it when technology cooperates with us. So, here we go. When death comes to reap a harvest in your families, indiscriminately taking the youngest before the oldest, you often say, God is not just, since he sacrifices the one who is strong and has a great future, while preserving those who have already lived many years full of disappointment. How often have we heard that? People are particularly distraught on planet Earth when a young person dies. And we may have been in the same situation. We may have said exactly the same thing. And today we're invited to see this particular challenge, affliction from a different perspective. Humans, this is what Sanson is telling us. Humans, it is in this matter that you must lift yourselves above the commonplace thoughts. So what he's inviting us is to go beyond our particular affliction when a young person dies. We must lift ourselves above the commonplace thoughts of life in order to understand that the good is often where you believe you are beholding evil. How many times do we see something good when it's really not so good? How many times do we think, oh, this is evil, this young person, why was this young person killed in this tragic accident? Poor parents. All of this is true on a certain level. But today we're invited to go higher, on a higher plane, and see that it's actually the reverse. Now, why is that? Why does Sanson ask us to lift ourselves above the common thoughts and to find the good where we often believe that there is evil? Why do you measure, Sanson is asking us, why do you measure divine justice according to your own? It's a form of pride, right, friends? When we question God's designs, right at that very moment, we become prideful because we think we know better. How can God allow this atrocity? But we don't know. We think we have the right perspective, we got the truth, but we don't, as we're learning right now. Why do you measure divine justice according to your own? We know that God is absolutely just and merciful and perfect. There is no question that God's design is absolute perfection. And we're invited to humble ourselves to that knowledge. Do you think the Lord of worlds inflicts you with cruel punishments out of mere caprice? I don't think so. We don't think so, right, friends? We don't think that God would inflict us with cruel punishments just out of mere caprice. No. Law of cause and effect. God's laws are absolutely just and merciful. There is never a mistake in God's designs. Nothing is done without an intelligent purpose. Nothing is done without an intelligent purpose. And no matter what happens, everything has its reason for being. Everything has a reason for being, has its reason for being. Everything. Can we even fathom that? Doesn't that help us to feel more resigned, to actually feel happier when we know that, when we truly, truly know that in the heart of hearts? If you were to better scrutinize all the pains that strike you, you would always find in them a divine reason. How comforting is that? We can actually breathe more easily, can't we, friends? If we know we're in good hands and our afflictions are absolutely perfect, even if we lose a child. Yes, it's easier said than done. But today's our invitation to water that seed of seeing death from yet a higher perspective. Premature death is frequently a great blessing that God grants to those who depart, thus preserving them from the miseries of life or the seductions that could have led them to their loss. Here it is. Here we're getting a glimpse of the other side, the picture of the other side of the coin. Premature death as being a great blessing that God grants, preserving those who die from the miseries of life or the seductions that could have led them to their loss. Those who die in the flower of youth are not victims of fatalism. They're not victims. Rather, God deemed it useful for them not to remain on earth any longer. It's a gift. This carnation is a gift, dear friends. We studied Heaven and Hell. There is several chapters in that book that help us understand discarnation, the death of our physical form, also from a different perspective. Allan Kardec has one chapter in Heaven and Hell that is called the transition or the passage. In there, he explains exactly what happens and why it happens and how it happens and how we can prepare and ought to prepare ourselves for death of the physical body. It would not and does not only help our own discarnation, but also for us to deal with the discarnation of our loved ones, our friends, our spiritual family members. So we're invited to know that God deemed it useful for his spirit not to stay longer on earth when they discarnate. It's a gift granted by God. It's an awful misfortune, you say, for a life so full of hopes to be cut short so soon. Don't we say that, friends? At least we think it, right? What hopes are you talking about? Sanson is asking us. What hopes? Do we even know? Those of earth were the ones who departed could have shown, making his or her way and fortune. This narrow way of looking at things is always what renders you incapable of rising above matter. So when we say it's an awful misfortune that this young person or anyone died, unless we don't say it when it's an older person, anyone, even in their 40s and 50s, we say that. What a misfortune. Oh my gosh. A life so full of hopes was cut short. It's a gift granted by God. And it's a narrow way of looking at things. And it renders us always incapable of rising above matter. It's a materialistic point of view, in other words. We're still not seeing, we're still not going in the other realm. We live in two spheres in the spirit life as a spirit and on earth with our physical bodies. And that is something that through Spiritism we're continuously invited to become aware of. Do you know what would have been the fate of that life, which according to you was so full of hopes? Did we know? Dear friends, the answer is no, we don't. We don't know what this person was saved from. We don't. Rejoice instead. Rejoice instead of complaining when it pleases God to take one of his children from his valley of misery. Rejoice. Because we are, according to Sanson, we're in the school, we're in the valley of misery. Why would we want to hold someone here only for selfish reasons, for our own reasons of attachment, and our lack of ability to see know the bigger picture, to question God's justice, God's mercy? Friends, we're invited one more time to be more humble, to humble ourselves, and to surrender to God's will. Would it not be selfish to wish for them to have remained in order to suffer along with us? Wouldn't it be selfish? Isn't our feelings of judgment and distraughtness, isn't it a form of selfishness? Now, it is very clear we need to grieve. We are at a level of development where it is absolutely vital that we feel our feelings. We're not saying that. But we're saying that at the same time, we're invited to not suffer unnecessarily. Because this is helping us by seeing with a bifocal lens, the bigger picture will help us to become happier quicker and to become more humble, and to learn to surrender to God's will and to recognize that there's never a mistake in God's design. That is the grief conceived by those who have no faith, who see in death an eternal separation. And that is another helpful, consoling message. It just appears to be that we are separated from our loved ones when they discarnate. It's because we're still very attached to matter. We still are quite materialistic. So we have a hard time really feeling, sensing, conversing, remembering that the spirits are around us, that they're not around us all the time, but we can converse with them. We can reach out to them, and they reach out to us. We're not as far away as we think. Mothers, you know, your beloved children are close to you. Yes, very close, Sanson says. Their fluidic bodies envelop you. How beautiful. But your unreasonable sorrow afflicts them too, because it denotes a lack of faith and is a revolt against God's will. So here he's pointing out yet another aspect. Our intense grief afflicts our discarnated loved ones. It makes it harder for them too. So we're not only doing ourselves a disservice, but we're also harming the discarnated loved ones. So let us remember that these spirits are with us. And he points out in particular to helping mothers to understand that your loved one, your little one, is around you. The fluidic body is enveloping those mothers. It's really quite consoling, isn't it? Isn't it helpful, dear friends, to have the gift of this perspective on death, particularly with the death of a young person? And let us practice faith. Suffering well is linked to faith. And we learned that last week as well. And if you like, we could go back to item, what is it? It's item 20, I believe, to reread the message where we were gifted with the remedy for evil, the remedy for afflictions is faith. So let us continue. You who understand the spirit life, listen to the beating of your heart calling to those loved ones. And if you would ask God to bless them, if we ask God to bless our loved ones who've discarnated, you would feel within you those powerful consolations that dry tears, those marvelous aspirations that show you the future promised by the sovereign Lord. Sanson, 1863. Thank you, Sanson. This is definitely a message that helps us to view death of the physical body in a completely different way. It invites us to rise ourselves above the common notion that it is an indescribable tragedy and maybe an injustice that a young person discarnates. And what does that show? It just shows us that we don't have faith, that we revolt against God's will, and that we do out of our own pride. All right, dear friends. So what do? We ask God to bless our loved ones. We reach out to them. We know that they were released from being on earth. And then we pray. We pray all the time, every day. And we ask God to bless our loved ones instead of making their lives in the spirit world, more difficult with our extreme sorrow. All right, dear friends, this was a deep lesson. Let us take a deep breath. It's a lot to digest. In the next lesson, the next passage, which is by Fenelon, and it came through in 1861, is dealing with the same subject matter and helps us further to help us with our perspective on death. It's entitled, If He Had Been a Good Man, He Would Have Died. It's item 22. You may pull out the gospel if you like, because we're only picking out certain sections of the chapter. When speaking of a bad person who has escaped some peril, you often say, if he had been a good man, he would have died. Well then, in saying this, you state a truth. When somebody evil, somebody with lots of ignorance dies, we always think that the good ones die younger. And now Fenelon is telling us there is some truth to it. As Sanson already invited us to rewrite our script by saying that it's actually a gift from God to be allowed to discarnate early. There are always exceptions, but we're invited to be at least open to that. Now Fenelon is helping us to look at this saying, if he had been a good man, he would have died, from a new perspective, renewed. So, well, when you're saying this, you're stating the truth, he says, because it just so happens that God often gives to a spirit who is still budding on the path of progress a longer trial than to a good spirit who, as a reward for its merit, will receive the grace of its trial, being as short as possible. So what is he saying here? Essentially, he's saying that a spirit who is less evolved may be granted a longer life to have more opportunity for growth than a spirit that is already more evolved and doesn't need that longer life. So this is yet another perspective. It doesn't apply in all cases because we know it's all very complex. It's never black or white, but it gives us yet another thought to consider when we see a not so conscious person living a very long life, which we often think is a gift, versus a more evolved, a person that's more dedicated to the good, is allowed to discarnate younger. It's just the reverse of what we're thinking, right? Usually, or what society believes. So let us continue. If a man dies, you rush to say, I would rather it had been him instead, meaning someone who is more inclined to ignorance. You're greatly mistaken, because the one who has departed has completed his task, whereas the one who remains perhaps has not even begun yet. So we're planting a seed of another perspective, another thought, that maybe the one who remains hasn't even begun their path of evolution yet. They need more time. So it is a gift in itself. But one more time, we are invited to not rush to judgment because we don't know. All we know is God is absolutely just and merciful, and God's design is perfect. And all we know is we're invited to surrender, to resign ourselves to it, without kicking and screaming, without thinking we know it better, without judgment. No, we need to have faith. That's the gist of this message tonight. Understand, therefore, that true freedom consists in deliverance from the bonds of the body. True freedom consists in deliverance from the bonds of the body. Beautiful, isn't it? Doesn't that help us to embrace discarnation, death of the physical body, in a totally new way? We think it does. And that as long as you are on the earth, you are in captivity. So as long as we're on earth, we are the ones who are in captivity. But true freedom consists in deliverance from the bonds of the body. So when somebody discarnates, young or old, wouldn't it be more correct to be joyful for them? And to put our own selfish feelings and attachments a little bit on the high shelf? It's a form of charity, isn't it, friends? Accustom yourselves not to criticize what you cannot understand, and believe that God is just in all things. That's our invitation. So that was Penelon. Item 22. Now let us move on to voluntary suffering. It's a little bit of a different slant, but it still deals with suffering and afflictions. This message is by the Spirit Fenelon again, this time in 1860. It's item 23. He talks about voluntary suffering. Now let's see, what is voluntary suffering? That's our question. He will help us. Human beings are constantly in search of the happiness that incessantly escapes them. For spotless happiness does not exist on the earth. So spotless happiness does not exist on the earth. And we heard that even last week. It's okay, because we know we're only here for a certain period of time, even if it's many lifetimes on planet Earth. And it's in our own hands to work on our inner transformation so that we will graduate eventually from planet Earth and will be reincarnated on a planet of regeneration where we will feel a certain repose, where love is the predominant force. And of course, planet Earth is also developing. It's planet Earth is in the process of becoming a planet of regeneration. So our lack of happiness, of perfect happiness, is not going to last forever. But of course, we're co-creators with God, so it's in our own hands, depending on how good a student we want to be. Humans search for happiness in perishable things. We do, don't we? Yes, if I only had this vacation on the beach. And yes, if I only had a bigger house in a nicer neighborhood, or maybe 2 or 3 houses. Yes, if I only had 3 cars, or a bigger car, or more children, or more money, or more this, that, and the other, right? All material things that are perishable. We can't take them with us at the end of our lives, number one. Number two, they can be destroyed, burn up, disappear from our lives today. So why would we want to hinge our happiness and even our security on perishable things? Good question, right? Reminds us of the moment when we're flying in an airplane and the turbulence hits. And what do? We grab our chair because we think the chair will save us. Little do we remember at the moment that it's actually attached to the very thing that's being bounced around in the air, right? That's us. We're just funny beings. So we humans search for happiness in perishable things instead of for pleasures of the soul. And that's what creates our unhappiness. Now let's continue. So we're invited to find happiness in the pleasures of our soul by nourishing our souls. How do we nourish our souls? Well, we read edifying, uplifting books. We attend study groups like this, learning about what the spirits on high are giving us in terms of a new, much more consoling perspective than we carry. We work on our inner transformation, which will help us to ease our life. In the sense, not that we will have less afflictions necessarily, but we will be able to bear them differently and better. Just as we're learning here in chapter 5, which is one of the pivotal chapters in the gospel, because we're all afflicted on earth. How else do we nourish our souls? Well, we all have our way of doing that. The key, however, commonality among nourishing our souls is that what we ingest for nourishing our souls will stay for us for immortality. So if we learn to play an instrument, if we learn new skills, if we do the good, if we're being of service, if we study and serve, the 2 wings of the bird, the 2 wings in us that need to be strengthened equally so that we can ascend to God. All of this is a form of nourishment of our souls. So, Fenelon is inviting us tonight not to put our eggs into the basket that is labeled perishable things, but to put our eggs in the basket that is labeled pleasures of the soul for immortality. It can't ever be taken away from us. Isn't that amazing? Why wouldn't we put our eggs in that basket? So let us see. Instead of seeking peace of mind, the only real happiness in this world, we humans are avid for anything that can agitate and upset them. So instead of pleasures, focusing on nourishing our souls, finding peace of mind by getting a more consoling, much more easy to live with perspective, which is the bifocal lens, because we're spiritual beings, we're spirits. Okay? That's all going to help us. We are now invited to not focus on that which gives us agitation or upsets us. Now, what are the two main reasons that upset us and agitate us? This is what Fenelon is telling us. Are there any greater torments? Are there any greater torments than those caused by envy and jealousy? There it is. He is honing in on envy and jealousy as one of the most volatile aspects of our life, which causes what? Voluntary suffering. That is how we make our lives hell. Envy and jealousy, leading to voluntary suffering. It's not the suffering that gets us anywhere. It's ultimately unnecessary. We're basically on the wrong horse, riding in the wrong direction, causing ourselves misery. Now, we have a little therapeutic question for us, and we don't need to answer it in public. Let us ask ourselves, am I prone to envy? Am I prone to be jealous? Let us take that into our daily review, our nightly review, to our daily meditations, and let us get to know ourselves better on this particular subject. Because it's not for no reason that Fenelon hones into jealousy and envy. It is something that is very prevalent on planet Earth. And it's, of course, something where we hinge our happiness on something perishable, because we're jealous that this person is talking to that person or looking at that person. That's perishable. That's short-lived. It's material. We envy the neighbor's car. We envy the neighbor's money, fame, fortune. It's all perishable. But we were invited to focus on what? Which will bring us more happiness. Nourishing our souls. Because that's for eternity, immortality. For the envious or jealous, there is no rest, he says. They are in a constant fever. It's true, isn't it? For those of us who've been jealous and envious, it's like a fever. It's taking us over, blinding us, creating voluntary suffering, incredible afflictions, and unrest. Even the sleep is often taken over, the lack of sleep as a result of it. It is not to them that these words apply. So what is he saying? He's saying, Fenelon is saying, that those who are envious or jealous will not be blessed because they're afflicted. So the words by Jesus, blessed are the afflicted, for they shall be comforted. That beatitude will not apply to those of us who indulge in envy and jealousy. Why is that? Why won't we be blessed in our affliction of jealousy and envy? Because their preoccupations are not those that bring compensation in heaven. It's voluntary suffering. It's not the affliction that, for example, a disease brings, that we chose or co-created for ourselves in order to expunge nodules we brought into this incarnation in our perispirit. and we suffer as a result. Now that affliction is something that's doing the good. And if we suffer well with lots of faith and resignation, as we learned last week, surrender, then this beatitude will apply. But if we create a voluntary suffering that's based on envy and jealousy, where we're focusing on transitory, materialistic situations and items and subject matters, Fenelon is saying we're not blessed then. We're not blessed and afflicted by, blessed are the afflicted. We're not the blessed afflicted ones. And we will not be comforted. He says, on the other hand, how many torments will those who know how to be content with what they have spare themselves? On the other hand, how many torments will those who know how to be content with what they have spare themselves? Those who behold without envy what they do not have, and who do not try to appear to be what they are not. It's all pride, right? These are always wealthy. So if we're not pretentious, we don't pretend to be somebody else. We don't pretend we have more than we actually do. Then, in other words, when we're authentic, when we're honest, humble, our will is aligned with God's will, that's when we're actually wealthy. Once again, in our society, we see the wealthy from a materialistic perspective. And here, even when it comes to wealth and suffering of not having it, the physical wealth, the materialistic wealth, we're invited to look at it from a totally different perspective, that's actually not wealth. True wealth is when we're humble, when we're authentic, when we're unpretentious. How wonderful. Since if they would look beneath themselves instead of above, they would always see persons who have even less. And that's the other thing. Why don't we rather turn to those that have less and support them? Offer our service to them. They are serene because they do not create imaginary needs for themselves. So if we're being authentic, if we're being humble, accepting, filled with faith, and we're afflicted, then the beatitude, blessed are the afflicted, for they shall be comforted, will kick in. And that's when we're truly wealthy, if we're unpretentious, when we reduce our pride and selfishness. Then we will find serenity, because we won't create imaginary needs for ourselves. The voluntary suffering this chapter is entitled with. And is not serenity in the midst of life's storms real happiness? And this is how the chapter ends. So how do we find real happiness? Through serenity. In the midst of the storm, which may be our lives, we may experience our life like a storm sometimes. How real happiness is serenity. And how do we reach that serenity? We don't focus on jealousy and envy. We don't focus only on the materialistic, or not at all on the materialistic. Instead, we nourish our souls. We will focus on the values of eternity, our soul values. We're humble, unpretentious, honest, authentic. That's where our true serenity, our true happiness, and our peace lies, peace of mind. So let us summarize. What did we learn today? These are 3 very deep lessons that came through from these 2 spirits, Fenelon and Sanson. We learned to rejoice when people discarnate. That's big, dear friends. Can we rejoice when people discarnate? And if we need to, we're invited to reread the gospel, particularly this section. Between heaven and hell is so helpful. Also, when we study all the different lessons that come through from the spirits, that study you can find on Kardec Radio, in the podcasts, on Facebook Live, and YouTube. You can find the whole study of all the cases of heaven and hell, the spirits who reported back, including the chapter of the passage and understanding the discarnation process and how we can prepare ourselves for our own discarnation and the discarnation of our loved ones. The books by André Louise also help us to get the bigger picture. So tonight we're invited, and we know it already, right? But we're invited to nourish the seed, to water the seed, that we can rejoice when people discarnate. True freedom lies in discarnation, we also learned. And voluntary suffering, which Fenelon focuses on particularly of envy and jealousy, does not warrant fulfillment of the beatitude. Blessed are the afflicted, for they shall be comforted. Of course, there's other suffering voluntary suffering that we may create for ourselves based on our ignorance, our lack of understanding. But generally speaking, if we over-focus on the material values and put all our eggs in that basket, we set ourselves up for suffering. And when it is voluntary suffering, we won't be comforted, and we won't be blessed. We're actually creating a more difficult life for ourselves. Dear friends, let us connect. Let us stop sharing and see whether there's anyone who has left a message or has any questions. Hi, dear friend Teresa. Thank you so much for joining. So lovely to see you here. Mark, thank you so much for being here. And Nora, dear friend, thank you for being here. Thank you, dear friends. There's a few more. Feel free, even if you don't have a question now, to post any questions where we'll go back and check. And next week, we will continue with chapter 5. Chapter 5 is the longest chapter in the gospel. And we will be continuing. Now we closed it and we have to find where it was. Next week, we will study true misfortune, which is in contrast to the voluntary suffering. So next week, we will be just going over this chapter and remind ourselves what was voluntary suffering based on envy and jealousy, materialistic focus. And next week, we will learn about the true misfortune and then melancholy. What does melancholy do? And we'll see how far we're getting. Thank you so much for joining. Much love, dear friends. And so God willing, we'll see you again next week, same place, with the continuation of this lovely study of the spirits, information of the spirit study of the gospel according to Spiritism. Take good care, dear friends. God bless you.